It was morning when Edra opened her eyes. Grey skies and grey cliffs formed together in her mind. Her back ached and she stretched her arms from underneath the boat's planked seating. It hadn't been the best plan in the world to hide in the pilgrim boats the night before. But she had to go somewhere else, somewhere she could make a bid to safety. And just as she was considering what to do next, there it was, the bag she had left behind, hidden under at the back of the seat on which she had sat the day before with the mother and the two children, discreetly secreted as they disembarked. A skein of geese honked overhead as they flew past, defining the sky from the cliffs. Where could she go? There was nothing here, Edra thought. The monastery was on an island. Her only hope was to get across the mile stretch of water the mainland and there consider her options. Edra's mind drifted to food as the grey sky was illuminated from behind by the sun, making the grey clouds paler and brighter. Could she sneak back to the monastery and find the kitchen, steal something? Leaving the silver bag back where Shev had found it, Edra jumped down onto the hard, wet sand, the movement of the estuary pushing the water about the fast boats, looking to her left, where she noticed the monastery gates now open. Perhaps if she... "I have found your daughter." A shout went up from Edra's right and the abbot Bedin, who had sold the family the room, taking her firmly the shoulder. "My child!" he exclaimed when he saw her appearance, straggly salt-encrusted hair from the rain in the night, damp clothes, dirty face. From out of the gates of the monastery the family came, the mother and her two boys first, the father looming like a cliff, face angry. The woman, seeing he had spied Edra, put her hand on his arm. "You, where have you been?" "Waiting here." Edra hoped she sounded penitent. "We missed you so much," declared the mother, who was now trying to keep up the pretense that she was their daughter. "He's not my father," Edra cried, as the gulls below mocked her petulant cry. "I am her guardian, as well she knows," said the man, eyeing the sword with envy. Edra hid it behind her back, looked beseechingly at the woman, trying to make out that she was innocent. She looked uncertainly at her husband, who was nursing his leg. But whatever had been the outcome of the conversation between Abbot Blathmack and the man in whose company she had been obliged to keep, she was back in possession. Then, from out of her unresisting grasp the abbot then wrenched her father's sword. He took it and handed it to the advancing man, who pulled the blade from its skin, his eyes gleaming in greed. "We can go aboard, and wait," the woman said hastily, hoisting her son and daughter over the taffrail. "You too." Edra hurried over to the seating under which the previous metals, coins and documents. She huddled over to the very edge of the seat, curling herself up to protect against the wind, glowering at the man, who was reveling in his new-found fortune. Edra's eyes fell upon the monastery doors again, open now for the pilgrims, who were beginning to proceed to their boats in groups, twos and threes, shouldering packs and weapons and children. Next to her, the man grumbled thanks to the abbot for reuniting his family, and crushed Edra hard against the side of the boat, her father's sword across his lap. Edra felt resentful, and was feeling hungry. Her hand ached, and she lowered her head, folding it towards her body. The woman, as if reading her mind, handed her a rather large piece of grain bread, which fell apart in her hands, having been partially consumed by insects, several of which dropped out and into her lap. The boats cast off and it was clear they were crossing the Dee and heading to the northern shore. Edra sat motionless, looking at the water, the sporadic sunlight glinting on the undulations every so often as she thought. Get away from this family, Edra knew. Get right away. Get her father's sword, if she could. The boats were swift. Already, the monk Beda, in a craft ahead of them, was on his feet by the pilot, gauging the flat piece of earth ahead of them, where they would land. Edra wriggled, giving a helpless look to the woman. But she looked away, instead fussing over her own children, deliberately avoiding Edra's eye. Fed a sword pushed painfully into her leg. What was his plan? Edra thought. If it was to rape her, he would have done it by now. He had been insistent on continuing the lie that she, Edra, was his daughter, and in the whole endeavor of leaving, the details of her arrival at Lindisfarne had been overlooked. Then, a thought occurred to Edra. If it was so, Then maybe she could use it to her advantage. She could pretend she was frightened, pretend she wanted to be with this family, and then no one would remember her mysterious arrival, and any inquiries sent from Bibbenberg. With renewed hope, Edra looked beyond the mud jetty, to the landscape beyond, and to the castle beyond, and realized she had seen it before. In a sketch in the back of one of Bibbenberg's holiest of manuscripts, the life of St. Oswald, Dunkeld Castle was drawn, as if the artist had sat on the very monastery bank behind them and drawn it to scale. It was home to the Pictish royal family, Father Bicker had told her. Those people long occupying the land in the north, he had said, his jaw set, and his mouth thin. They are the first peoples of this land, and they owned Northumbria too, until the Romans built the Great Wall. She had asked how he knew this. Bicker had explained that the Romans had written all of this down and, miraculously, when Rome had fallen to the barbarian, the documents had miraculously escaped destruction. So, the Picts are barbarians? Edra had asked. Father Bicker had narrowed his eyes. They are Christians, as are we. They neighbor the Dalriadans, who brought St. Columba's Christian teachings to Lindisfarne. So, they are not enemies? Edra had pressed. They are enemies when they choose, or us. Edra's mind filled with her beloved Father Bicker as their boat was dragged to the shore. One of the monks she recognized from the evening before put out a long, broad arm to help her out. The man thrust fed a sword across her stomach, which caused her to lose her reach, and she was thrust back against the seat. She looked down, humbly. Clearly, if she was going to play along being part of this family, she had to be submissive. The other 8 pilgrims passed in front of Edra as the monks helped them out, followed next by the mother and children of the family. Wait here, growled the man, pulling up his arm with which he had pinned Edra to her seat, and he proceeded to help his family up the bank, using the biscabarded sword for support. We are going on, the monk, who had tried to help her, said, looking down kindly to Edra. Your father is, he broke off, apparently not knowing how to finish the sentence as the family strode off after the pilgrims. Perhaps. He is very protective of me, Edra offered, reaching under the bench boards. The bag was still there. Could she run? The monk held out his hand to haul her up. She took it. He wants to make sure we. But Edra, too, did not finish her sentence. Behind the monk a roar, like the loudest storm Edra had ever heard. She looked up, expecting the downpour. Ahead of her, on the dry road ahead, a castle loomed, like a sea eagle, the turrets to either side of the main gateway spreading out over the countryside as if predating it. The monk turned, in pursuit of the rest of the pilgrim party. Edra took a few steps towards him. Then froze. The ground shook as the hooves of hundreds of horses skirted out from the side of Dunnottar Castle, making a whooping, screeching sound. She looked at the monk, who had dropped low to the ground, the skein of pilgrims still as they watched the riders approach, before scattering and fleeing, to the hillocks near the estuary, towards the castle, back towards the boats. That had been a mistake. Those shambling back towards Edra were being scooped up and hacked down by axes and swinging metal fixed to poles. She stumbled back. Just a few feet from the boat now, and she scrubbed for the reeds to help her back in. Now the gate of the castle was opening, a gate banging open. More men poured out, and Edra could see that they were dressed similarly to her uncle's troops, plain helmet and leather clothing tight-fitting, spilling out behind the rider QT the front, arraying out to engage the others who had appeared on the field of battle first. They must be Norse, Edra reasoned. Their clothing was made of animal skins, their fair hair in elaborate braids. But before her mind could reckon on what to do next, to seize the boat, or to hide, her eye was drawn to a pair of riders who were charging at a small group near the narrow strand next to the estuary, one of them holding aloft a sword inexpertly and failing to do any damage or deflect any blow. Edra strained upwards behind large clumps of grass that were between the castle and the boats. It was the family she had fallen in with. The father was wielding fed a sword as he was cut down, his wife and children next. Could she get to the sword? Even now, with the castle soldiers in pursuit training blows on horses' legs and mouths and on Norse bodies, the army was being drawn. It couldn't. They couldn't have been any more than 100 yards from Edra. But a drawn army was still dangerous. If it had continued fighting somewhere else, it could just as easily come back. But her father's sword. Keeping low, she skittered across the mud and gravel to the corpse of father, trying her best to look at him as she got the sword over his already stiffening fingers. A shout and a low scream drew her attention, and she grasped at the sword as she scanned the horrifying picture around her. The scream came again, this time much closer. From the thin, wispy sure grass tore a figure, that of a child with a Norseman behind. The rider raised his arm, the battle axe in his grasp raised high in order to inflict a deadly blow to the child. Edra tore forwards, upsetting a rolled-up pack lost, no doubt, by an unfortunate from her party. The contents, some books and scrolls, and several apples, rolled out. The horse skittered on them, then reared back on its hind legs. The Norseman lost his balance and was thrown. The child tore towards her. Edra grabbed his hand, pulling him faster than his legs wanted to carry him, until his legs were sore from the rough soil and grass. Down to the waterline Edra tore, still holding fast to the child. She searched for her boat, the one Edra had the silver on. After a minute or so of frantic searching, Edra spied it, the craft that had brought her, under which had having pulled and pushed itself between the others. She stepped forward. But the little boy suddenly dropped her hand. Edra turned. The child whose life she had just saved was folding his arms, imperiously. "You have to come with me," Edra insisted. She grabbed out at the boy, who wriggled out of her grasp, a look of indignation on his face. "Come on," Edra insisted, looking over the tussock. "They're going to kill you, and me if we don't moke." As she spoke, a horse rider was bearing down on them. Edra got up. "Come on," she repeated, taking the boy's forearm. She began to run, the boy tumbling after her, but the child slipped on the wet grass, his leather boots flailing as he went down. There was nothing for it. Too late. This rider, this Norseman, was closing down on them, an axe raised. And then Edra looked again. As the boy flailed, it was clear the warrior was closing down on him. He hadn't seen her. The warrior, in single-minded pursuit of the boy, who had now stopped still, staring at his end, had not seen Edra, staring at him. Edra moved. Why, she never did know. But it was the start of her many battles, fear dissolving about her as she stepped out from the grassy hillock, withdrawing the sword once belonging to her father, its wisps and curls, birthmarks of manufacture, catching the morning sunlight. And ran. She had no real idea what she was doing. Sword blazing into action, Edra ran at the rider, slashing her arm from left to right. And the rider had still not seen her. But the horse had. Whether newly trained or simply fearful of danger, it had seen the figure brandishing a weapon and charging towards it. It reared to its hind hooves, its rider tumbling off. And all the time the boy had simply been staring. Edra bore down on the warrior. Mad, crazy, that idea was. A 10-year-old girl with a GV sword preparing to attack a Norseman. But the man was dazed, scrabbling for his axe. No thoughts passed through Edra's mind now as she raised her arm, the metal of the sword blade making inaccurate incisions into the man's face and chest. Come on. This was the boy now, stirring himself into voice, calling Edra away, and she was brought back to the present, the roar of battle behind them. Not stopping to clean the blade, Edra stumbled towards him. They had been going to the boats, she recalled. Pulling the boy by the arm, who seemed much more willing to go with her this, Edra searched the estuary bank for the boats, specifically, her boat. A crescendo of noise behind them caused her to run faster, ignoring now the pain in her hand caused by the pressure of holding the sword. Throwing it into the one which was hers, she took the terrified boy by the woolen shoals of his tunic. As if her mind had been at ease, she might have noticed the significance of this. But it wasn't. Warriors now were pouring in their direction. Under the seat. Edra yelled, as the boy skittered around on the boards at the bottom. Then she, too, launched herself into it, scrabbling herself under the bench on which she had sat not half an hour before, reaching out for the sword. The horses came to a standstill. Edra waited, listening, trying not to breathe as the horses huffed while their riders waited. She looked across to the bench at the other side of the boat. She could not see the boy, he was well tucked under in there. Edra shifted her leg. Must be still. Must be. Voices drew Edra's attention. She didn't know how long they had been there, the light betrayed no shadow, and the gentle lulling of the water had caused her to close her eyes. But she was wide awake now, her body stiff as she listened as a rustle and a thud vibrated through the boat's wood. Her first thought was of the boy adjacent. Was he still there or had he gone? She could not tell. She stretched out her arm, carefully, her fingers touching the bag so Brit had placed in the tiny rowing boat she had piloted to the Holy Island 2 days before. Coming her hand around it, Edru pushed it far into her tunic, the coins jostling for position. And then froze again. Voices were even nearer now. Could it be the man she had stabbed? It was true, she hadn't the strength to skewer deeper. A foot stepped onto the boat, and then another. To Edra's horror she could see the trail of blood spots, faint but still obvious, from the deck, over the taffrail and back out onto the grass, where they glittered like rubies, betrayed by the sun. Knees-covered feet. Whoever had found his way into the boat had noticed them too. Edra tried to hold her breath, noticing something opposite. The boy's leg flashed forward, for just a second. It had not been seen by the knees. And yet, he was not gone either. Saynid. The man called out, towards the bank. His muffled cry answered with another pair of feet stepping into the boat. And then, Edra was pulled out by the ankle with a huge hand. She screamed as she was pulled upright, expecting the face to be that of the Norse she had just stabbed. But he wasn't Norse. This warrior was shorter and slighter, long black hair contrasting against his pale face. He shook Edra hard by the shoulder. Edra felt the money clinkle slightly under her tunic. I. Edra gasped. We saw you with the king's nephew. The heir to the throne. The warrior called Saynid snarled at her, then noticed her Farthet's sword. Even on the scabbard, it had dried blood. Ye have killed him? Speak, lad, lest ye burn on the fire, as happens to all that are traitors. He picked her up painfully by the shoulder. Others were gathered on the bank now, clad as this man was, in dark leather bands over their shoulders, staring through their close-fitted helmets at her. Was this the end? Was she going to be beaten, or worse? I'm here. A voice behind the warrior sounded, clear and bright. It would be a voice Edra would come to recognize as well as her own. Saynid swung his head round, his long, black braid down his back whipping shortly after him. It's Constantine. A shout went up as the man Saynid crouched lower to inspect the child. Edra stared too. It was the boy who Edra had pulled with her. He had been hiding under the seat all the time. Go, off with you, the man growled, then stared at Edra. You too. Constantine was helped to the bank by the onlookers. Edra still had the coins in her shirt, which tinkled as she walked, as she followed the boy, who came to a halt in front of a man, taller than the rest, giving the impression to Edra herself, that he was the raptor bird who nested in the imposing castle looming behind him. The tall man stood little way above them, on higher ground, his backdrop a concluded battle of massacred people, men and horse corpses littering the scene. The man looked down to the boy but said nothing for a time. The man Saynid took some steps towards the tall man, saying something for a considerable amount of time to him. He looked at the boy again, and then his piercing eyes fixed on Edra before addressing Saynid. He stood by the boy, around them serene coiled upwards from the dead bodies of the dead, of men and women. And children. It was clear the Norse were bent on extermination of all on this plane. Edra could see the bodies of the 2 young children belonging to the woman who had been so kind to her, both huddling together, their bodies run though. She shudderux. You found my nephew, he intoned, not taking his eyes off Edra. Yes, my king. It was Saynid who answered. And you? He spoke to Edra now, his face fixed, but his eyes, rather than inviting her to respond, seemed to fix her mouth closed. He rescued me, Uncle, the boy answered for her. He found me on the battlefield. And you say you found him, General Sainid? Hiding in a boat. He held aloft Edra's father's sword. So, this was the king? Edra thought. They were in Pictish territory, so he must be king of the Picts. Yet, with his long black hair, like that of his general, and his set leather dappled dress, he looked more like a Gael, like the ones she had seen in the books she was not supposed to read by the Lindisfarne monks who had charted the histories of the peoples of Alba, which she had found one day in Bibbenberg's chapel and read voraciously. Did he recognize her? It was possible that G.E. would recognize her father's sword, soiled with treliquor of the enemy. Her father had been the Lord of Northumbria. Perhaps this king had met him, treated with him, done battle against or alongside him. That is my father's sword. Edra's voice sang over the picturesque landscape. If the picture was one of destruction, annihilation and devastation. King took slow steps towards Edra, the sullied weapon in his hand. But it was the boy next to him, whose life she had saved, who spoke. What is your name? He looked keenly at her, as if eyeing a particularly interesting stone found on a beach. Edra did not answer immediately. It was folly to confide her real name, of course. Her mind ranged through many. And then, as if thunderstruck, her kind rested on a name from records in Bibbenberg Chapel. Osrith, said Edra. Your family? There. She pointed past King, to the dead Lincolnshire family. We were going to Iona. No one is going to Iona, said the king's general, softly. There is no one left, child. You will come with us. No. Edra screamed, more for herself, than any of the destruction around her. Culdees would surely correspond with Lindisfarne about this massacre. Some of its monks were dead too, and being walled up inside a Pictish castle would be a fast way of her uncle locating her. Then, you can go, girl, Sainid said, dismissively. A weight lifted from Edra's shoulder. But, Constantine rushed to her. No. Constantine shouted. No. Then you come with us, declared. You mean something to the boy, I dare say. Stay with him, for now. You are to live in the kitchen. We can never have many maids. He nodded to Sainid to indicate she should be taken with them. When my nephew desires your company, you will find you. Here. Handed Edra back the bloody sword that was once her father's, bestowing on her the job of her life. You are to defend him. 88,888,888. 30th of October 899. It was raining still as Osrith hauled her aching body towards the thick, heavy gates which guarded the fortress palace of Dunkeld, the seat of the king of Alba. Had it been mild, had she arrived in daylight, fresh, energetic and no newborn within her clothing, Osrith may have been inclined to reminisce. But rain was pouring down her back and the lanolin-coated fleece was protecting the child from a drenching. Osrith looked up and, because her hand was cold from the downpour, trembled as she reached for the door. Who is it that demands audience with the king? The guard at the gates of the fortress and royal palace demanded and, on seeing her, laughed. Under Edra's tunic, under her shirt, the bairn shifted in her sleep, sighing quietly into her chest. Asleep, thought Osrith, contented. Osrith's mind flicked immediately to her mother as she thought about the events of the last week, Utad threatening to tell Edward that she had been seen at Cripplegate, the threat of job loss. He's a bastard, Finan had said, stroking her hair. Had it only been 3 days ago? It was the last time they had slept together. She felt content when she was with Finan, somehow all gathered in, like an autumn harvest, and now here she was, leaving him again. She had given the boat captain the silver, Finan's silver, the piece he had once given her to help her go north. And Osrith had gone north, up the coast of East Anglia and of Northumbria. They passed Bibbenberg, and Lindisfarne, had arrived at Culdees, then crossed to Dunnottar. Her knocking had brought the attention of someone, a guard, whose face glowered through the wooden hatch guarded with metal bars shot open. He looked as drenched as Edra felt. I say you are nothing but a peasant woman begging for crusts for your bastard, the guard began. He eyed her appearance, smutted face, burnt hair and cinched clothes. It was true, she hadn't had time to Washington, but she had had time to take her silver and gold. That had got them this far. Osrith's hand flexed around the hilt of her father's sword. Not his best sword, that had been lost to the Danes on the field of battle on the day he died, and Yugtad was lost. But it sang well. "I am Edra," she said, whispering sharply now. The guard strained to hear. "Edri?" the man repeated, glowering over her. "Constantine's companion. I saved his life from the Danes when Saint Cuthbert was brought," she added, then narrowed her eyes. "You were there, I recall." The guard shifted, uncomfortably, then asked, "Who should I say calls, my lady?" Edra looked up. 22 years had not been enough for this predator-bird-like fortress. And she was here, fleeing to the one man who was more like her brother than Yugtad. Or, given their past, perhaps not. She waited, as the cold, October rain leaked through every gap it could. The baby girl beneath her jerkin was awake now and on the hunt for food. Osrith, of the Idings. She had learned about this princess, of the family of Oswald, the lost saint, who married Coleard in Mercia. The Mersons had always believed she was a spy, and was killed on suspicion of being such. She gave her life to Mercia. It had been over 100 years ago. Osrith still remembered when Dunnottar told her about the princess, sitting as he had been on a low stool near a warming fire, on a night not much different to the one which was soaking her through now. Princess Osrith had been loyal, and misunderstood, Dunnottar had explained. But it had been Osrith who had buried her uncle Oswald's body, having revolvered as much of it as she could after it had been dismembered in battle against the Mercian king Penda near Welsh border, and sacrilege performed upon it. Osrith had taken it to Lincolnshire, to the monks at Bardney. It was long believed that if his body was recovered it would begin the process of creating a united Saxon realm. "I am Osrith. Tell the king," she rushed to the grill, glaring at the guard. "Tell king that it is Osrith who requests to. What was she going to request? She loosened her jerkin straps as the baby wriggled, letting the leather buckles hang beside her. The baby rooted, and hit the mark. "To resume my role as decreed by His Royal Highness." The Gused sneered. Osrith slammed her feet onto the ground and bore down on the door. "Osrith of Bibbenberg." Osrith clarified. "Tell the king I have come to make him a land bargain," she added, as the guard slid the panel across with force. For, a bag of silver would not keep a child till she was an adult. Osrith knew she needed a home for young Edra. So there was only one more thing that she could offer. Something that Maxinado wanted dearly.